Hi, and thanks for joining me on In Talks With. I'm Danielle Radoichin. For this episode, I travelled to the Lightbox, the regional contemporary art gallery in Surrey, just outside of London, where its recently appointed director, Sarah Brown, made the unconventional decision to showcase an exhibition of works by Lucian Freud, which had originally been planned as a standalone project, alongside an adjacent exhibition curated by the young British female artist Somaya Critchlow, called The Solar Sphere. Running until the 19th of March 2023, the Freud side of the exhibition features a range of portraits, nudes and photos spanning the artist's career, while the Solar Sphere, which sits in the same room, is filled with works by Somaya's grandfather, Keith Critchlow, who was an artist, author, professor of art and architecture and expert in sacred geometry, as well as works by his contemporaries and some by Somaya herself. The effect is highly complementary and serves to afford the viewer the chance to look at Freud through a fresh, namely female and contemporary lens. I spoke separately to both Sarah and Somaya to hear more about their motivations and inspirations behind the project. Hi, Sarah.
Hi.
Thank you so much for joining me on the In Talks With podcast.
Thank you for the invitation.
We were just talking in the gallery earlier and you said you've been here since 2021.
So I joined the Lightbox as director in December 2021. So it's just over a year that I've been in post.
And you've got this really exciting exhibition on at the moment, which is sort of two exhibitions merged into one. It's quite unusual, I think, in the setup. And it took me a little while to get my head around the idea, but it's really interesting. Can you just talk me through it?
Yes. So Lucian Freud and the Solar Sphere is an exhibition that brings together works by Lucian Freud, etchings, paintings, drawings and photographs, alongside an exhibition entitled The Solar Sphere, which is curated by the artist Somaya Critchlow, which really reviews her personal relationship with her grandfather, Keith Critchlow, who was an artist of the same generation as Freud, along with Leon Kossoff, Frank Auerback, Frank Bowling and Kathy Kollwitz. So it's these two exhibitions that together, I think, inform an incredibly rich show of painting and the kind of resurgence of figurative painting.
Was there always the plan to do the Freud and then the Somaya idea evolved around that?
Yes. So when I joined the Lightbox, there was a Lucian Freud exhibition in the pipeline, absolutely, on the occasion of his centenary alongside the National Gallery. Beautiful exhibitions at the Garden Museum of Freud's plants and flowers, and also in the Freud Museum of his home. So yes, that was very much part of the Lightbox's future programme. And it was my invitation to Somaya to kind of, I guess, have that conversation about Freud from a contemporary artist perspective, which I think in the whole centenary exhibitions, we are probably the only exhibition to kind of pursue that line of inquiry. And I think what struck me about Freud, looking at Freud now, is the figure. And we've seen this resurgence of the subject of figurative painting coming about in the last few years that I think is really interesting.
So I just wanted to come back to that in a minute, but just first of all, the paintings that comprise of the Freud part of the exhibition, where are they from? What are they? Because I know a lot of people listening to this will be huge Freud fans and will want to know how these paintings are different to what's on show at the National, for example.
So the paintings that we have on display here at the Lightbox are from, we've brought them together from the Tate, from the British Council, from Arts Council collection, from major national loans, but also from public collections that people don't often have access to. So we've got a wonderful work from Rochdale, from Swindon, from other public collections that hold Freud's work. So it's a real opportunity to see Freud's that are brought together that you otherwise would not have the chance to see.
What's your personal favourite that's on show?
That's a tough question. I think the painting of Freud's mother is very striking. So just after his father died, Freud began painting his mother very regularly. And there's an incredible intensity in Freud's portraits that we all perhaps know, but obviously the one, the kind of incredible relationship with his mother, and that sort of intensity also of when he began to make those paintings was after his father's death. So I think there's that, that study of grief and personal relationships. The other work that I think is also particularly striking and perhaps is quite pivotal in the exhibition is The Girl with Egg, which is a portrait of Freud's girlfriend, muse, Celia Paul, the artist Celia Paul. And it's an incredibly vulnerable work. But also looking at that and knowing about Celia Paul's own work, I think is really interesting. And she actually revisited that subject later in her life and her work. So those two probably are the most pivotal.
And tell me about let's expand on what you were saying earlier about how you were thinking of Somaya to bring a more contemporary viewpoint to Freud.
So I first came across Somaya Critchlow's work during the pandemic, actually. It was when we were all experiencing paintings and sculptures online, and I saw her work through Maximilian William Gallery, London, and Instagram, and I was just really struck by the figure and the representations of women in her work, and this kind of collision of hip hop kind of cult, sort of music, popular culture with Sickert came to mind, Freud, but figurative painting. And her works, when I first saw them in the real, are incredibly small and intimate and intense, in that the scale really doesn't belie their impact. So she was an artist that I was really interested in talking to, and when I could, I used the first opportunity to meet her. And the recent exhibition of Sickert at the Tate Gallery, she'd written about Sickert, and I sort of was struck by absolutely the figure in her work, but her combination and knowledge of the history of art, I think, was very interesting. And through that, and then my conversations with her and her gallery, kind of the opportunity to kind of consider that conversation with Lucian Freud arose. And that then led to seeing the exhibition that she'd curated about her grandfather's work, The Solar Sphere.
It's a great title. It's quite evocative. What does it
mean,
so
The Solar Sphere is the title of Keith Critchlow's publication, one of his...
so he was an architect.
So he was an architect, a geometer, a scholar of Islamic art, and he wrote this seminal text, The Solar Sphere. He also wrote a beautiful book on the geometry of nature and flowers. He taught a whole generation of artists and architects, and his influence kind of went into design. And obviously, hugely pivotal relationship with his granddaughter, Somaya. He died in 2020, so during the pandemic. And the exhibition that Somaya had curated was, I think, a deeply personal show that brought together his work alongside his peers, but also her relationship to him and her family's relationship to him, and his influence on her. And the book, The Solar Sphere, is incredibly hard to get hold of. Actually, Peter Hall, the exhibitions curator, went to the British Museum to read it. Oh, really? And so it's the British Library to read the publication, and we sort of have a copy of it, and it's an incredibly rich piece of work that the title of the exhibition comes from. But it's that sort of holistic understanding of culture, religion, art, and the human condition.
And when you saw Somaya's curation, did it make did it bring to mind any surprising thoughts that you hadn't had before seeing Freud in the context of these other pictures?
I think the exhibition that she'd curated included Freud. It included Freud alongside his peers, some that perhaps we know well, like Leon Kossoff and Frank Auerback, but others that perhaps, like Frank Bowling, despite the major retrospective show that he had at Tate, as an artist that many people are not aware of.
And were these people their peers of Keith? But did he move in a circle with them, or was he friends or associates of theirs?
Yes, he was friends. He was a lifelong friend of Frank Bowling. I think Kathy Kollwitz is another artist who we haven't, there's the recently opened modernism show at the Royal Academy, which includes her work, but again, an artist that's been overlooked. I think, it presents a kind of generation of those artists where the conversations between their work, between drawing, between painting, between the figure, abstraction, but also they were friends. Keith Critchlow and Frank Bowling were in the RAF together. So there's a beautifully intimate drawing of Frank Bowling asleep, which was just a page from Keith Critchlow's sketchbook that kind of has that, very personal, incredibly personal relationship and intimacy in it. That's really lovely to see.
And Somaya's own drawings, you were talking about figurative and how there's a fashion for that, for figurative painting again. How does Freud's figurative paintings look compared, what does her images bring to his, and how do the two reflect each other? I mean, I'm thinking of what's the kind of 21st century reading of Freud when you see...
You have to ask Somaya about that.
I will be asking her about it.
Samaya's probably best placed.
I suppose.
I mean, she talks about the influence of Freud on her work in terms of representing the human condition and thinking about that through representing the figure and vulnerability, strength.
The nude.
The nude, and particularly the nude. I think, Freud's... I mean, we were very aware that, Freud's nudes are, really laid bare, and there's just an incredible vulnerability that sometimes is quite hard to look at. And I think Somaya's representation of nudes are equally, she draws upon almost a kind of, sort of 1950s pin-up, bordering upon a kind of pornographic and then coupled with the fact that they are Black female nudes. There's something really powerful in the way that she has taken ownership of that subject. Taken that subject in terms of her. She talks about when she was working, when she was studying art, where did she see representations of herself? And, we're so used to the history of art, men representing women, men representing women of colour, and what is it like to be a young artist growing up, and what are your reference points, and how do you take ownership and kind of claim that history, which I think is what interests me about Somaya's work.
That's interesting. Did Freud ever come to Woking? Do you know?
I don't know. I don't know.
I was wondering if there was a kind of geographical connection that I'd missed.
Not that I know, though I'm sure as soon as you do a podcast and we put it out there, we'll get back. We will find out. So
is this your first exhibition since you've been director? And how does this fit into your broader plan for going forward of what you'd like to do with the Lightbox?
So I think the Lightbox, the Lightbox is a beautiful building. Julia Barfield, architect design building, opened in 2007, won the Museum of the Year award in 2008. It's this incredibly, simple but elegant box, essentially. And the main gallery is has an incredible height to it. There's a fantastic staircase, a big entrance hall. We house the Ingram collection, which is a strong collection of 20th century British modern art by the philanthropist Chris Ingram. We also are responsible for the heritage collection of Woking, and Woking has this history of, H.G. Wells, The War in the World, Paul Weller, the Jam, but also a history that many people don't know. So Woking is home to the very first mosque that was built in the UK, the Shah Jah Mosque, in 1890s. And it also has an incredible literary history, not least H.G. Wells, but Hilary Mantel, the Japanese novelist, Ishiagu. So I think it's a place that is incredibly rich in its own right, but we are also 24 minutes from central London. We've done shows with Bridget Riley, with Canaletto, with Turner, Constable. There's an incredibly rich history, but I'm quite keen that it's that conversation with contemporary artists. It's that really exciting opportunity to look at the world now, and that I think so many artists offer us. And we've recently been awarded Arts Council of England funding to become a national portfolio organisation. And we are the only contemporary, purpose-built contemporary art gallery in Surrey. So that feels like a kind of exciting moment. Lightbox is also a really new organisation. We're just 15 years old. 2023 is our 15th year. So it feels like, an adolescent that is coming of age.
Well, Sarah Brown, thank you so much for joining me on the In Talks With podcast. And I'm going to go and have a look round the show now.
Thank you very much, Danielle, for the invitation. Really great.
After travelling to the Lightbox, I was intrigued to hear Somaya's own thoughts on the solar sphere and Freud. We spoke to each other over Zoom. Your show at the Lightbox in Woking, Lucian Freud and the Solar Sphere, I think it opened there last November and it's running until mid-March. I was wondering how you're feeling about it now that it's been in situ for a little while.
Yeah, I feel good about it. It's interesting because obviously we, well, maybe not obviously, but earlier in the year, last year, I curated the show The Solar Sphere, which had Lucian Freud's work in it, and then as a result came about curating the show at the Lightbox of the two alongside each other. I don't know. I think it was such a kind of honor to be asked and to have the privilege to put together a selection of Freud's works, because I'm such a huge fan of his painting, and to be so up close and personal with them was really a really wonderful experience. And I feel really good about it. I think the two exhibitions speak a lot to my sort of interest in art and my own practice and just thoughts and feelings around artwork. And so it's been a really good experience. I feel, it's been a nice personal experience also.
Yeah, because the theme of the exhibition is anchored around your grandfather. What is it about his legacy that particularly resonates with your own?
I guess it's a very personal history in that growing up with him around, he was very encouraging of me to kind of paint, and sort of took me to lots of exhibitions and kind of spoke about lots of strange things like geometry and Plato and all these things that seem to kind of come back up continuously for me in my own practice and in thinking about art. And just, I don't know, I think in that way of maybe you have a sort of like mentor or someone above you that really exposes you or shares with you what they love about a sort of things that exist in the world. And so I was really lucky to have that, as well as to feel, that art was something that I connected with also. And I just think he had a really interesting viewpoint when it came to the arts that was in a way very like niche and very very specific to what he was interested in, because it was sort of, he studied as a painter. So the exhibition was a nice opportunity to show this, because I think a lot of people know him for geometry and architecture and books that he's written. But he passed away during COVID. And so we were able to kind of go through his studio, and there'd always been paintings in my grandparents' house, but to kind of put this work together and to show it and sort of think about the context of it in line with how he ended up becoming more involved with geometry and Islamic arts. Just such a nice dialogue, I think, of like how arts interconnect and play out in a person's lifetime.
Do you have any particular memories of him with regards to him showing you art or telling you about things?
Yeah, I think one that was really strong was he used to take me to a lot of exhibitions at the National Gallery, and we went to a Delacroix exhibition. And he took me when I was young, but it was maybe the first time we went to an exhibition after I'd got back from university and I was a little bit older. And he just said we didn't need to read any of the text, and we should look and discuss what we thought we saw in the works, or what we liked and didn't like. And just things like that really were helpful. And when I was struggling at university, because you have to write a lot about why you're doing what you're doing, and obviously you're quite young, or I felt very young at that age, and there was one point where we have to write about why we're doing what we're doing, and I was like, I don't really know totally, to be honest. I can pick out lots of things to validate it. And he sent me this really interesting essay written by Plato, which sort of spoke about how there were like these 4 bases of experiential things, which eventually, I hope I'm explaining this right, it's been a while since I read it, that make up the 5th. And the 5th is this idea of something that you kind of can't touch or see, but you know, and it exists because of the 4 before it. And just sort of, I guess, helping me to think about art and interpreting the world in a way that didn't have to be pinned down to an explanation. And yeah, I guess he was saying that Plato often alluded to the fact that there were things in the arts that they create a feeling of something that's not so tangible.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. I love the way that what you just touched on as well, about how he crossed over into this sort of interdisciplinary art sphere. He wasn't just working in architecture or geometry, but you mentioned the captions at the Delacroix exhibition that you went to with him. Is that something you were thinking about when you were curating the solar sphere? Because I did notice the captions when I was walking around, and they're quite spare.
Yeah, I think it's important because, you go to these big, amazing exhibitions, often at museums and institutions, and I get why there's wall text. It's obviously necessary, and there's such a broad range of people that go, and people who know lots about someone or don't, and it's interesting to find out things. But I do think sometimes, it's artwork on the wall. You kind of, my opinion is to look. I don't need it over theorized or over explained, because in a way it takes away from that initial, you might see something from looking, but if you're just told what to see, maybe you won't look or be able to see certain things. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So as I mentioned, I spoke to Sarah, who has been the director at the Lightbox since 2021. Well, I was wondering what it was like working with her, and what qualities you feel she's brought to the experience of visiting the Lightbox.
Yeah, I mean, it's really great to work with her. And again, it was so lovely because it tied in with this personal narrative, and she saw the exhibition, The Solar Sphere. And then one of my grandfather's students, Julia Barfield, designed the Lightbox. So there was all these connections that Sarah noticed.
So she's part of the architect team that built the London Eye.
Yes.
Famously. I'm just creating a bit of a touch point for people. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's true. And actually that was always, I think my grandfather advised them on the London Eye. So as kids, we used to get tickets for free. And I remember actually going over to their house when I was very small. So yeah, it all links in, which I think is wonderful. And I love that Sarah was able to kind of, I didn't know that one of his students had designed the Lightbox. So that was like really lovely news for me. And I think also kind of, I think it's It's definitely an interesting dialogue for someone like me to have been able to curate the Freud show. I'm a woman, I'm Black, I have a totally perhaps different viewpoint. And I think that Sarah kind of asking me to that is really lovely and alongside the exhibition. And it made sense because I'd included Freud in the presentation I'd initially curated. But I think, that brings a fascinating dialogue to the Lightbox in the links of it being designed by a student of my grandfather, and then my own interest continued in the arts, and, tying it all together.
I felt when I visited the gallery, I could really feel this fresh that was what struck me, was that it was this really fresh perspective, this really fresh way of looking at Freud. Obviously, I think it was the Lucian Freud show was planned as a standalone exhibition before Sarah had begun in post, and the fact that she brought you in and that you'd obviously been talking about all these things is so interesting and just makes the show completely new. And obviously, Freud is often talked about as, he is part of this male cohort of artists that's quite macho. You hear a lot about, obviously, all the coolness and the glamour and hanging out in Soho. But it's often seen through, he was working at a time when women weren't really given much attention or time, as artists themselves. But what's interesting with what you're doing is obviously there's creating this whole new dialogue, like you said, and looking at it, you can really tell that there's this new contemporary female gaze, which I think is really interesting. Sarah told me that she was particularly struck by the representation of the female figure in your work, and that was one of the first things she noticed, and also the scale, the small scale, and how it reminded her of the paintings of Sickert. I know you've written about him, as well as Freud. And I just wanted to quote, because she said that about you, her works are intimate and intense in that the scale doesn't belie their impact. Obviously with just going back to Freud again, obviously so much has been discussed and talked about how his process when painting the nude, we've seen lots of photos of him. We've heard, his models have been interviewed at great length, and we know about how he treated them, and we know a lot about the process. But I was wondering about your process and how you approach painting your nudes. Are you painting from life? Is there a different process? What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, initially the work sort of came about. I often get asked if they're self-portraits, and they're not self-portraits, although maybe some of them have more of a direct link, or perhaps occasionally feel similar, that you could call them a self-portrait, even though I don't think they're not. And if so, they'd be more of a sort of psychological version, one of many. And so sort of the work did come about from drawing a lot in the life room and doing a lot of life studies. And then eventually I sort of turned it on myself, and I was sketching myself from life. And then as it's kind of grown, and having done so many classes, a lot of it was, I went through a phase where it was very heavily relied on imagination and just working from what I kind of knew from taking life drawing classes. Like I did a residency not too long ago in Cornwall, and I was doing life drawing classes alongside my own studio practice. And I think, so this combination. And then as I've kind of gone on and wanted to sort of challenge myself or improve paintings, I have began a little bit more to use my own body or myself to look at from life, because you kind of can't get the same depth of tonality and volume and shape and movement, I think, when you're using a flat image. But so that's sort of my process at the moment, is if I ever look at a model from life, it's often myself. And then otherwise I tend to rely on having gone to life drawing classes or sort of images that I've used and in a way altered quite a lot, so they're in a different state from the original.
And what about the sort of style and appearance of the nudes? I mean, they've been compared, I've read, they've been compared to 1950s images of Hollywood starlets. Is that a comparison you relish or you recognise, or do you see that kind of coming from somewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I looked at a lot of like 1950s porn mags and things like that. So I get there's certain references, and I think sort of hair-wise or clothing-wise or little bits and pieces, it's time periods that have obviously resonated with me and that I've kind of taken little bits from that I think people are referencing. I don't think so much I think about the sort of, the pin-up aspect of it. That's not something that I'm particularly interested in or was ever really trying to do.
But you actively went and looked. So what led you to that particular era, those particular porn magazines?
Well, I think you're looking at, I was very young. I studied at the drawing school and did lots of life drawing classes. And I was very intrigued by this idea that nudity is acceptable in one area and not another, and how that reads through. So I think I was being sort of,
Do you mean acceptable? Sorry, I'm just going to push through that idea a bit. Do you mean acceptable as in a society doesn't accept pornography, but it does accept a artistic nude? Is that what you mean, or do you mean?
I guess there's this really there's this long dialogue of the female nude in art, and the fact that women have been portrayed by men for years and years, and often in a nude state. And this is something I wrote about when I wrote a little piece for Tate on the Sickert exhibition, sort of Walter Sickert's own discussion on the female nude and how it was sort of had become synonymous with an unrealistic ideal that was a bit ridiculous, and how upset people were by his own nude paintings of women, not with this idealized body shape. And again, I just think going back to the life room and being able to draw and paint from nude models, because the life room is considered this sort of safe space where nudity is allowed. And I agree, I do think for myself, if you're painting or drawing figuratively, you do probably need to observe the body in its kind of natural state without clothing. And also you have a body, and it's fascinating to sort of learn and understand how different parts of the body connect, where muscle definition is, where different things are. But I think in terms of when you're making paintings, you're creating this sort of visual language about that references things whether you mean to or not. And the life room has this kind of status of nudity that has purpose and is understood, although there's a lot of critique around it as well, and the female nude in painting. And I just think, I guess beyond even thinking about pornography, I was thinking about the types of bodies, the types of people, the kind of portrayals in those life rooms, the setups, and then offsetting them by, an obvious place to look for source material if you want nude figures is porn. And I wasn't looking for what contemporary porn is, which is a totally different thing. We're talking about these softcore magazines from the 1950s. They're not the ones I was looking at. They're very weirdly they're a bit like the life room, but they could just be a little bit more over dramatized in certain areas. And these sort of characters, and a lot of my early work was about characters and characterization. So I think, it's just somewhere.
And do you feel like, just going back to what we were saying about perspectives, do you feel like as a Black woman painting a female nude that there's a different feeling that the viewer might have when they're looking at it to when they're looking at something like a Freud? Or do you think that's an overread?
Gosh, I don't know. I'm sure there are definitely, I wouldn't want to speak on behalf of anyone else, but I'm sure there are probably differences in how imagery comes together, just purely in the way it's handled and by whom, and the sensitivities that one has to it. My own myself being a Black woman is going to probably end up with a different outcome to perhaps someone else who's not a Black woman painting a nude Black woman. That I think is just something that would happen, and sort of the experiences and things that I would pick up on, or that someone else would pick on, that they'd imbue with work, which is, I think, how the nude sort of became this silly depiction of idealism. So I think I've sort of lost myself rambling now.
No, not at all. No, you're being very articulate, and my question was quite broad anyway, so it's probably my fault. But I suppose, well, do you think that, going back to Keith, maybe, do you think that he, what do you think he would have thought about today's world, where it seems that we're trying to hopefully give more of a voice to different types of perspectives in visual culture?
Yeah, I mean, he was the one who taught me about openness and crossing over. So I think it'd be very interesting. I mean, I grew up in a household which it was like from him and my grandma's perspective, it was, you know, there was this religious iconography everywhere, but it was very much about or being very respectful of all religions. And
was he Christian?
No, not particularly, not at all. But just in, you know, it's funny actually, because I realized recently I was looking at a lot of Renaissance painting, and they actually studied geometry heavily, and there was this dual interaction between the two. And I think my granddad, just in being sort of, I would call him a philosopher to some degree. And all the different areas that he worked in, you know, it's like when you go to the National Gallery, my favorite thing to do is to start at the beginning and walk around to the present time. You start, and artwork really began in religious depictions in the West, and that is part of its journey. And as it progresses into sort of social awareness to then expression. So I think his openness or all these things that cross over, yeah, and I think he was great. He also spoke about how Plato sort of said that in a fair society, women and men would be equal, and in that sense, it meant possibility that women had the capability to be as sort of stereotypically typecast we cast men as cruel, and the idea that sort of the world might be a better place if women were in charge, which isn't necessary, but women having this capacity to be as cruel as men. And I mean, my granddad came from a sort of white background. My grandma was half Jamaican and half Irish, and he started out as a painter and then ended up meeting Buckminster Fuller and becoming a geometrist and a systems theorist. And I think his whole being sort of encapsulated this idea that things change and move through phases and interconnect. And that's in a way what the exhibition was curated around. In his text, The Soul as Sphere is taken from a book that he wrote in response, I think, to Jung or alongside Jung's ideas. And really, when you're talking about visual imagery and just life, everything starts from this center point, this circle, and then it has a circumference. And I think I was trying to sort of pull all these sort of very abstract things together.
Wow, yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. Yeah. It's a lot to talk about for a Friday morning, but it's all it's really, really interesting. And how nice that you can bring his memory alive through your work. Yeah. So you had a show at the Maximilian William Gallery in London last year, a solo show, and you're obviously still so young and just getting started, but you've done loads of amazing stuff already. I was wondering what you're working on going forward.
Yeah, so I've got I'm been working on, and it will open soon, as a show at Flag Art Institution in New York, and that will be kind of a collection of works that I've made over the past few years. So it's not like a new work show, but it'd be really lovely for me, especially as some of the past few years shows have been in COVID or there's been different times. So it's a really nice opportunity that I thought to bring and curate a selection of works together.
So exciting. Well, good luck with it. And I look forward to hearing more about that. Somaya Critchlow, thank you so much for talking to me. I've really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. It's been really nice to talk about the exhibition of my grandfather, so thanks.
You've been listening to In Talks with me, Danielle Radoichin. The sound and theme music is by Woogie Productions, and the artwork is by Patrick Wall. If you enjoyed this episode, please pass it on to someone who you think might also like it. Please subscribe and leave a review. To pitch for guest ideas, you can DM me via my socials at Danielle Radoichin. Thanks for listening.